As you may have guessed from the title, in this video I'm going to discuss how to defeat the devil and ensure a positive future for humanity which guarantees our freedom, opportunity, and our sacred right to continually grow spiritually. When I refer to the devil, I'm not referring only to Satan himself, but to all those whose souls are unified in representing evil, which primarily manifests through the selfish desire to deceive, harm, and enslave the minds and souls of others for their own selfish and often profane purposes. Tragically, there are many in this world who, knowingly or unknowingly, represent these destructive characteristics. And thus it is the moral duty of all who are motivated by love to ensure that good people are protected from those sorts of schemes. This moral obligation to interfere and assert our power over evil is something that some spiritual seekers are not always comfortable with, since they would rather shy away from conflict. But the fact of the matter is that when we are threatened with injustice, with cruelty, with conspiracies to enslave us and our children physically or mentally, the only way to prevent such wicked wills from being imposed upon us is to confront them with greater power and greater truth than they are threatening us with. To be neutral in the face of injustice is to choose the side of the oppressor, and it's important that anybody who wishes to improve the fate of the earth and of humanity understand that deeply, because there are many forces of wickedness and principalities of evil who act upon this world, and any effort to improve the lot of humanity is deemed by them to be a threat to their power, and they will absolutely attack anyone who begins to free others from deception or uplift their virtue and love. So it's very important to learn to build our spiritual armor and not be afraid to assert ourselves when confronted with injustice or deception. And all of that's a bit basic to those who are familiar with these things, but it's nonetheless extremely important that we build a solid foundation of these basic underlying psycho-spiritual principles, especially when we consider how best to free those who are held hostage by the mind control of the devil, who are not aware at all of certain fundamental properties of logic and virtue, and can't fathom the level of infinite deviousness and cruelty which is employed to deceive them. The complicity of these people who are deceived and held hostage by the devil is an extraordinarily important battlefield in regards to the fate of humanity. So we should always consider ways in which we can present the truth to them, which they may be more receptive to. For example, people have been socially conditioned to have an adverse reaction to the idea of mind control, and they aren't necessarily aware that that's actually due to subliminal mind control to make them disregard the idea of mind control. Therefore, we might avoid terms such as mind control when discussing that sort of thing with them, and instead use the term mental manipulation. Further, while almost everybody is familiar with the stories of Plato's cave and the Trojan horse, truly impressing those ideas upon those who are held spiritually hostage by the devil, which is the majority of people in the world, can be very beneficial to their ability to develop skepticism. In more specific terms, all the mainstream media outlets are giant Plato's caves, which are injecting demonic Trojan horses into the minds and spirits of humanity by filling people with a false sense of moral and intellectual authority, which is actually just mentally manipulating them into a limited and often very hateful and destructive belief structure and demeanor. They do this by injecting false virtues into people and convincing them that anyone who does not share their false virtue deserves to be destroyed or condemned. And now it's very important to understand and discuss these false virtues because they're an extremely common tactic of the devil. The devil always wants people to be willing to destroy each other over superimposed ideas of false moral authority, because that's one of the easiest ways to control people and ensure that they don't discover true moral authority and begin to reject the pervasive deceptions that the devil designs, and uplift and heal one another rather than constantly squabbling against our fellows, who largely all just want to improve the world and our collective fate, but have merely been led towards differing opinions of how that should be done. The devil knows that false virtues are more effective at misdirecting the will and actions of humanity than trying to convince people to actually be evil. Because very few people want to consider themselves evil, but almost everybody wants to consider themselves morally and intellectually superior to others. Our perceived virtues, whether truly beneficial or deceptively inverted, directly impose upon our beliefs, which determine our motivations and actions, which directly determine the fate of the earth. How we determine truth and how we determine virtue are the foundation upon which we build the future of humanity. So it's extremely important that we spend time meditating on and reinforcing that foundation, so that when we are confronted with deceivers or those who are misguided, we can discuss our potentially more accurate truth and our potentially more beneficial virtue with dignity and grace that might more effectively influence others to redefine their own motivations in such a way that leads them to heal and uplift our fellow man and facilitate greater freedom and prosperity through the way we live our lives, which will forever influence a more positive future. Once we develop within ourselves a solid foundation of virtue, logic, and love, such that we are ready to impress these things upon the world in an effort to assure that these principles prevail over the degrading and wicked deceptions of those whose selfish and cruel motivations can only be considered akin to demons, it is important to acknowledge that there are two primary audiences which we will be in conflict with. These audiences are those who are merely deceived and those who are actively and consciously wicked and striving to deceive and degrade others. There is, of course, a spectrum therein, but it's important to recognize that the vast majority of people, even many of the people who are involved in such organizations as MSNBC or CNN, are so deceived that they do not see their own actions as deceptive or degrading as they strive to make people condemn and hate one another. We must possess the wisdom to recognize that it is foolish to totally condemn those who have merely been misguided and led onto false virtues. It's not entirely their own fault. Only those who are actively and truly consciously malicious should be utterly rejected, while we should strive to employ more grace, tact, and forgiveness with those who have merely been deceived into thinking that destructive and cruel philosophies are morally superior. The ability to distinguish between those who are truly threatening and malicious and those who are merely held hostage by them is extraordinarily important and should ideally be something that global human culture examines in greater detail. For example, within America, Democrats should be encouraged to confront that those who support Trump are not doing so for all the reasons that they have been led to hate Trump, but have entirely different belief structures and understandings, and so even if these people despise Trump, they should recognize that it's foolish and wasteful to necessarily condemn and hate everyone who supports him. Likewise, conservatives who see the MSM as purely wicked deceivers should be encouraged to recognize that those who believe all the lies and intellectually insulting deceptions that the demonologists who run the MSM continuously saturate humanity with, they're not necessarily believing those things because they themselves are malicious and hateful, but they've just been deceived into believing false virtues. Therefore, it's likewise wasteful to condemn them. We should save our energy to protect ourselves from those who are truly malicious and be patient with those who are merely foolish. It's possible to reject ideals with dignity and grace without simply being bound towards frivolous bitterness. Anyhow, that's all I wanted to discuss today. It's a bit of a summary and reiteration of a lot of things that I previously talked about, but I believe it to be very important that people solidify these ideals within themselves and able to have a more accurate understanding of the world and of how to solidify and purify the foundational motivations of ourselves and others, which fundamentally define our future. It's a lot harder to impose false virtues and bitterness and division among mankind when we can collectively understand the underlying motivations of those who constantly utilize such psychospiritual deceptions and able to weaken and mentally manipulate us, and we are prepared to defend our virtue and our truth from them. If there's anybody who you think might benefit from this message, please go ahead and share this with them. One of the primary tools of the devil currently is, of course, the ability to blacklist people like me who are sharing this sort of content with the world. And I assure you that I am maximally blacklisted by the forces of evil who own social media. So these words will not reach anyone unless they are organically shared among those who desire to uplift humanity and protect our future. And again, I know a lot of this is rather intuitive and basic, but it's extremely important that we help people to build more solid foundations upon which to guide their understanding of the world and their own power. because trying to build a tower without a solid foundation is naturally a recipe for disaster. The best way to help people grow in truth and virtue and avoid destructive and cruel tendencies is to help them understand how to protect their own growth and more accurately see the nature of the world around them. And that's not built by necessarily trying to drag people into 9-dimensional vortex mathematics and how to channel spirits and how there's a giant conspiracy to get everybody to disregard the idea of conspiracies. It's built by helping people discern between more basic good and evil, more basic truth and fiction, and how to truly understand one another and how to reject ideas without being necessarily hateful or condemning people. So on that note, I'll let you go. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk, and let me know if you have any questions or general commentary in the comment section.